Welcome back, everyone. We're starting off today by going into these double standards that we're seeing on these social gatherings, especially in New York, but also elsewhere. Also, the GOP has a report out allegedly saying the WHO was complicit in the Chinese Communist Party's virus cover-up. We'll also be looking at New York criminals freed over this virus, going back and committing crimes without consequence. Now that said, folks, before we get started, we do have a Patreon now, and this show is again being censored on YouTube. So if you want to support us, please join our Patreon, join the Crossroads team. The link is in the description below. Now let's jump into the first story of today. So double standards on these social gatherings. You all might have seen this viral tweet that went out of this video showing these New York City parks workers welding shut the door of a Middletown playground. I'll show a clip of this now. So that was at Lynch Park, and they did it so kids could not play in the park. Again, local officials here are allegedly, at least in their words, claiming that they're worried about social distancing and things like that. Many New Yorkers, on the other hand, are saying, didn't you just allow hundreds of thousands of people to go and protest on the streets? And you were saying social justice is more important than social distancing? Here we have a video of the Jewish community in Brooklyn getting together and cutting that fence back open.
Open it up wide.
Now here we have a tweet from Joel M. Petlin. He said this on Twitter, quote, "Friday we learned that summer sleepaway camps would not open in New York. Kids are being turned away from playgrounds in Brooklyn. Yet just a few miles away, this rally occurred today. The lockdown is over except for the camps, schools, and stores that are forced to comply with it." So there's this concern, at least very heavily in New York, about the double standards that government officials are having on these social gatherings. That individual points out that kids are still being held to these standards. Businesses, schools, different types of community gatherings like people getting together at a bar. All of them are being targeted by these laws and these rules that the governments have put in place. But if you want to go hold a mass protest or riot, you are not held by the same standards. Now, Cuomo, the governor of New York, does seem to be holding his grounds that he's against any kind of social gathering that violates these standards. You have to remember that he had a break from Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York. Governor Cuomo, for example, criticized Bill de Blasio's stance of not bringing in the National Guard during the height of these riots. And he's saying here, quote, "We have received 25,000 complaints of reopening violations. Bars or restaurants that violate the law can lose their liquor license. People with open containers in the street can be fined. Police and protesters not wearing masks can be fined. Local government must enforce the law." And he continues on this. He says, "The violation complaints are predominantly from Manhattan and the Hamptons. Lots of violations of social distancing, parties in the street, restaurants and bars ignoring laws." And he says, enforce the law or there will be state action. And so what is he talking about? He's talking about bars. He's talking about individuals breaking these different standards of social distancing. He's not really, it seems to be calling out these mass protests. Again, and that's one of the big pieces of criticism here. They're encouraging them. They're allowing them. They're not really doing much to break them up unless they go out and burn down buildings or violently riot. But meanwhile, there's something they are against, and they're coming out very heavily on this. So this is Twitter, Brad Parscale, the Trump campaign manager. He says over 1 million ticket requests for the real Donald Trump MAGA rally in Tulsa on Saturday. Before entering, each guest will get temperature check, hand sanitizer, mask. There will be precautions for the heat and bottled water as well. And many different organizations are criticizing this now. The same ones that talked about it's okay to social gather if you're protesting. But we're saying that social justice, again, is more important than social distancing. Here we have NBC News. They say, quote, "Rally for Black Trans Lives draws packed crowd in Brooklyn Museum Plaza." And we should note, too, the imagery of that gathering is one of the ones being used to challenge the legitimacy of some of the recent actions being taken in New York. But right after that, what does NBC post? Well, they post this article from Associated Press. They say this, quote, extraordinarily dangerous. Trump rally draws grave concerns from top health officials. And so why is it good and a great thing if you gather for these social justice programs, but extremely dangerous if it's on something on the opposite side of the aisle? And again, this brings up the bigger question that people are raising right now. Are you doing these social distancing laws? Are you enforcing them selectively? Is the criticism selective? And it does appear to be so. Meanwhile, this is from the city. It says New York City COVID-19 contact tracers. In other words, these individuals that are being deployed across the city to go and figure out who you've been in contact with to find out if you've been in touch with the virus or someone who has the virus. They're saying they're not being asked about the George Floyd protest participation, despite fears of a new virus wave. Read a couple quotes from this. They say, quote, no person will be asked proactively if they attended a protest. That's from Avery Cohen, a spokesperson for Bill de Blasio, in an email response to questions by the city. It continues, quote, instead, test and trace workers ask COVID-positive individuals general questions to help them, quote, recall contacts and individuals they may have exposed, Cohen said. Among the initial questions, do you live with anyone in your home? And so what are we seeing here? We're seeing people calling into question the legitimacy of these politicians, of these programs, and of the claims they have that this is a threat to public health. All these regulations on social distancing are being interpreted in context of the politicians allowing the mass protests and riots to take place. And it's bringing up this big question is why is one type of gathering being tolerated and why is another type of gathering being criticized? And we're seeing now it's not just, oh, well, these protests have, say, political significance and so we can't restrict their political voice. Because these same people are criticizing the Trump rally. That is a political gathering, whether you agree with it or not. And so it's not political, right? It's not because they care about, say, supporting all free politics. No. It's not about supporting these different types of social gatherings of different communities or ethnic groups in New York. For example, the Jewish community is one of the biggest groups being targeted by this, at least on the surface, by Bill de Blasio's policies. And so what is it really about, right? And this brings up the big question here. Are we seeing unequal enforcement of justice? Why do they defend one and make it sound like the other is dangerous? Why do they defend one, promote one, encourage people to go out and support one, while saying the other side is dangerous? And again, we're seeing this. Unequal enforcement of law is not justice. Select enforcement undermines the basis of law. And we see now in New York that many people are questioning the legitimacy of law. Now moving on, GOP report allegedly says the WHO is complicit in the CCP virus. National Review says they got an exclusive document on this, so we can't fully confirm it ourselves. But here's what they say. They say House GOP report finds WHO complicit in Beijing's COVID-19 cover-up, calls for Director Tedros' ouster. We'll read a couple quotes from this. They say China violated the international health regulations at the World Health Organization in the early days of the coronavirus outbreak. Republicans on the House Foreign Affairs Committee allege in a new report on the origins of the pandemic. They say the interim 50-page report, a copy of which was obtained by the National Review, also raises new questions about the complicit role the WHO played in allowing the Chinese Communist Party to delay crucial information about the novel virus. It recommends that WHO Director General Tedros be removed from his position for his, quote, full-throated defense of the CCP's response and embrace of their revisionist history, and calls for an international investigation into the CCP's failure to slow the spread of the virus. And here's a quote from that document. It is highly likely the ongoing pandemic could have been prevented. As such, it is incumbent upon the United States and like-minded WHO member states to ensure the accountability and reforms necessary to prevent the CCP's malfeasance of giving rise to a third pandemic during the 21st century. And it continues, in some as early as mid-December and no later than December 27th, the CCP had enough information to assess it was legally obligated to inform the WHO that the outbreak in Wuhan was an event that may constitute a public health emergency and international concern. Had the CCP not been committed to covering up the outbreak, it would have answered yes to all 4 of the criteria and notified the WHO. The CCP failed to do so. Now, y'all may remember this infographic we went over of the complicit nature of the WHO in covering up this virus, in covering up the Chinese Communist Party's actions to censor it, to lie to the world, and even perpetuating some of those lies. We went over that in a previous episode. You can check it out if you'd like. And we're seeing now also the Trump administration has already cut funding to the WHO. We have a video of this here.
We will be today terminating our relationship with the World Health Organization and redirecting those funds to other worldwide and deserving urgent global public health needs.
And so where do things stand right now on the WHO and the CCP? Well, if that report's real, and even if it is not real, there are pushes to right now investigate the WHO for its involvement with the CCP on the spread of this virus in terms of lying to the world, and also looking into the actions of the Chinese Communist Party to cover it up, to mislead the world. And very likely, we'll see what more can be done to the WHO in that, but at the very least, we may be seeing sanctions, further sanctions, against the Chinese Communist Party and possibly even lawsuits. Now in New York, back to New York meanwhile, criminals who were freed over virus concerns are again committing crimes, and they're doing it now without consequence. Now this is from NBC. They say NYPD brass, we're arresting too many prisoners on early COVID release. And here's what they say, quote, hundreds of prisoners released early from Rikers, that's Rikers Island, the prison in New York, due to COVID concerns are being enabled to re-offend again and again without consequences, law enforcement leaders say. Here's what they're saying, quote, we're continuing to see people get arrested over and over and let right back out. And it really defies common sense. NYPD Commissioner Dermot Shea said in an interview with NBC New York. They say that of the approximately 2,500 defendants sprung from Rikers early because of COVID safety planning, at least 250 have been arrested again since. And that's according to Michael Lee Petrie, Chief of Crime Control Strategies for NYPD. And notably, these 250 reoffenders have been arrested 450 times during the pandemic. So what are we seeing here? The 250 out of the 2,500 are just the ones who have been caught. And that is in the very permissive state of law enforcement that we're seeing in New York right now, where many police are afraid to enforce a law because they're afraid of being punished themselves, and also of the attacks they may face for that. And it's also being done in context of these, say, pushes to release these prisoners right ahead of the riots and looting, which some people have been calling into question of, you release all these prisoners back onto the streets, you release these criminals back onto the streets, and then when the people go around and start rioting and looting, you don't do anything to stop it, or you do very little to stop it. And this is again also in context of the push to defund the police in New York City. They've released these criminals back onto the street, and now they want to defund the police. Now moving on to another topic, you may have seen some different reports on this, and I wanted to state here what really happened with this. This was the gender identity law the Trump administration changed. So what really happened with this? You have an Epoch Times story here. HHS rule removes non-discrimination protection for gender identity. Now you would have seen a very different take on this story depending on which media you read. Here we have it as accurately as we could possibly state it. Here's a couple quotes from this story. Quote, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, finalized a rule June 12th that follows on federal court rulings, finding the Obama administration overreached when it issued an unusual rule prohibiting discrimination in health care and health insurance on the basis of patients', quote, internal sense of gender. Here's a quote from that story again. HHS respects the dignity of every human being, and as we have shown in our response to the pandemic, we vigorously protect and enforce the civil rights of all to the fullest extent permitted by the laws as passed by Congress. And that's according to Roger Severino, Director of the Office for Civil Rights at HHS, and that was in a statement. Now the article continues, the new rule, according to the agency, could save hospitals, insurers, and others $2.9 billion over 5 years by relieving them of regulatory burdens. And the new rule unveiled by Severino deals with non-discrimination provisions in Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, the Obamacare statute. The law declared it unlawful to discriminate on the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, age, or disability in certain healthcare programs and activities. And in 2016, the Obama administration published an HHS rule interpreting sex to mean sexual identity or gender, which it defines as, quote, one's internal sense of gender, which may be male, female, neither, or a combination of male and female. Now, finding that this rule was probably contrary to the applicable civil rights law, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and the Administrative Procedure Act, a federal court preliminary enjoined it at the end of 2016. The court finalized its judgment in October 2019, striking down the offending provisions of the rule. A second federal court concurred. And so in other words, it was seen to be in violation of these different acts back in 2016 and finally finalized in 2019, just recently. Now, this also ties into a bigger picture of what the Trump administration is doing right now. One of the big things they're doing in terms of getting the economy back on its feet after this virus pandemic is over is cutting regulation. Now, two different factors in this. One is they have the Federal Reserve bringing interest rates down to zero, which means lending is easier. There's more money in the economy. It's easier to build things, easier to get loans. And in addition to that, the Trump administration is cutting these different regulations that make it difficult for buildings to, say, get built, for workers to get contracts, and for businesses to move forward with different infrastructure projects. He's cutting the red tape, clearing the way for these things. We're seeing the same thing with that gender identity law that the different health administrations had to follow. Again, it was a thing that put into place red tape that they had to abide by. It was seen to be, say, in violation of other existing laws way back in 2016, only recently repealed. Now that said, folks, we are again broadcasting the show Monday through Friday, 5 days a week, so please tune in. We're going to be covering the CCP virus. We're going to be looking at the different things happening in the U.S. We'll also be covering some international news and also doing a lot more on China again. That said as well, this show is being censored by YouTube. We really need your support. We have launched a Patreon. So if you want to support this channel, join us on Patreon. And also we will be broadcasting our videos at 7:30 p.m., so a bit earlier on Patreon if you'd like to sign up there. Again, you can find the link to that in the description below. That said, folks, again, we're broadcasting Monday through Friday, 5 days a week. Please tune in next time. Take care of yourselves. Please stay healthy, stay safe. Thanks again.